Hey everybody, this is Billy. Okay, so here's the thing. When I was out in Laurel Canyon last year, creating all this footage and all this documentation for the Laurel Canyon miniseries, that was literally like a year ago, because it's May of 2022 right now. And I was out there like in May, June, and July of 2021. And so I came home in fall and I started doing the editing. And I got to be honest with you, one of those particular episodes was not great. There was a lot of mistakes in it. There were some typos. I messed up some addresses. I even got some really simple information wrong. And in that course of the year, I learned a lot of things. So here's what I decided to do. I decided to re-edit one of those videos, and it may end up being two. So that's what I did. And so if you've already seen the second half of episode 6, which is the one that's got David Crosby, Graham Nash, Joni Mitchell, and the beginning of the Frank Zappa story, well, then you might not want to go back and rewatch it again. But I will tell you this. There is some unused footage at the very end. So at the least, you might want to just fast forward to the last 5 or 7 minutes of the video and take a look at that unused footage. I just didn't know what to do with it. And the truth is, I still have more. So I may re-edit another one or another two, just depending on how egregious the mistakes were. So thank you for bearing with me. Anyway, here you go. Have fun. Take care. Welcome back, everybody, to the second half of episode 6 in our Laurel Canyon miniseries. And we're just going to pick it up again right at the point where we left off, and that was in October of 1967, when David Crosby had just met Joni Mitchell in a coffeehouse music venue in Coconut Grove, Florida, where she was playing a solo acoustic gig and out on tour by herself in places that she had booked on her own. At the age of 24, Joni Mitchell was an unsigned but a promising artist, and basically managing and promoting herself, along with a little bit of help from a man named Elliot Roberts, whom she had met in New York City in 1966. Now, just a quick side note about Elliot Roberts. While he would eventually go on to become a monumental and a legendary figure within the music business, co-founding Asylum Records with David Geffen in 1971, and then going on to manage the careers of both Neil Young and Tom Petty, as well as later on the Talking Heads, Devo, and even Mazzy Star. But in 1967, he was still very young and very new to the whole music industry game, and he had very few industry contacts that would have been helpful at all to Joni Mitchell at this point in the early part of her career. So really, we're not so much talking about just a meeting between David Crosby and Joni Mitchell, but really more like a meeting of all three of them together. Because after David had thoroughly charmed Joni enough to the point of where she agreed to become basically his musical protege, it was actually Elliot Roberts who finally convinced her that she and he should probably move out to the Los Angeles area and start over out there, working with David Crosby and all of his many music industry contacts. Now remember, in 1967, David Crosby was actually a pretty big star, and she definitely knew that he had been a singer and a guitarist in the Byrds, and that if he was being honest at all about his interest in her career, then she knew that he was going to be able to help her, at least in some way. And so, she agreed to it. All of it. And in the late months of 1967, both she and Elliot Roberts moved here to Laurel Canyon, and they lived with David Crosby until they eventually got their own places to stay. Now, let's talk a bit more about David Crosby again, and this time, let's take a closer look at what exactly it was that he was trying to accomplish here with Joni Mitchell, based on the events that took place very shortly after this fateful meeting in Florida. So, here's how it all went down. After David and Joni had gone on their little sailing trip, and after they had all gotten themselves back over to Los Angeles, and then settled into the music scene that was there. Now, David Crosby wasted no time at all in trying to not only get Joni Mitchell signed to a record deal, which he did, and more on that in just a minute, but also to raise her professional profile within the Los Angeles music community. Now, Joni began playing regularly at the Troubadour in West Hollywood, and David made sure that he hosted as many social gatherings as he possibly could to essentially show her off to everyone that he knew. Now, all of this worked, by the way, and within just a few short months, he had pulled strings and had her signed with Reprise Records, whose roster included the Kinks and Jimi Hendrix. Okay, but here's the thing. Crosby was working some other angles here with this signing with Reprise Records. Now, that's not to say that all of his intentions were bad or dishonest. Let's just say that David Crosby viewed this professional relationship with Joni Mitchell as a symbiotic one, and he was determined that he was going to get something out of all of this as well. So, even though Crosby had no experience at all as a producer, he somehow convinced Reprise Records that it should be him as the producer of this debut album. And they bought into that idea because Crosby had been in the Byrds, and that they were basically the group that had almost more or less invented the American version of folk rock. Now, it was actually the Beatles who had done that first in the UK with the release of the album Beatles for Sale. But never mind that for now. They believed that his intentions were to make her into a folk rocker and do the same thing with her music that had been done with some of the early Simon and Garfunkel releases that were overdubbed later with bass and drums and electric guitars, which Simon and Garfunkel also did not really appreciate, by the way. Now, in reality, he had absolutely no intention at all of doing any of that. Crosby's real intentions were actually to literally just not produce her at all, which after it was all said and done, he really didn't seem to know how to do anyway, by his own admission. Again, more on that part in just a bit. Now, what he really wanted was simply a producer's credit on an album, and he wanted to make sure that no one else was going to touch her music at all and do things to it that neither he nor Joni Mitchell wanted done. Joni wanted to present her songs in exactly the same way that she had been presenting them all along up to this point. And that was simply with just her voice and an acoustic guitar. That's it. And by the time anyone at Reprise had heard any of these final recordings and realized that it was just Joni and her guitar, it was too late for them to demand a complete re-recording of the entire album based on their budget constraints. So, David Crosby succeeded in this respect in protecting Joni's songs from those who would have made them into folk rock singles and much more in tune with what was popular at that time, and much more likely to become commercially successful. But having David Crosby as the producer on this album turned out to be a bit more of a mixed blessing than was originally planned, as I will now explain. Without getting into too much technical jargon that only studio engineers are going to completely, fully understand, let me just explain a couple of odd things that he did that caused all of these problems. First of all, he had Joni sing into a microphone that was placed directly in front of the open case of an upright piano. Take a look at this photo here, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. The hammers and the piano strings are exposed, and even though she wasn't playing the piano, she was singing directly into it. Now, I have no idea where he got this technique from, whether he saw someone else trying to do this and then he just didn't do it correctly himself, or if he just made it up and came up with this whole idea himself. Either way, it just really didn't work. And then he attempted to place additional mics near the actual piano strings in hopes that he would be able to record the resonance of the strings as they vibrated while she sang. Now, as a recording musician and as a studio owner myself, I have never heard of anyone else doing this, ever. Maybe you have. I have not. The problem arose when he had to turn up the gain on these mics so hot due to the faint sound that the strings were emitting in this process that he actually just ended up recording mostly a bunch of white noise. And there was a faint electrical hum that was very audible in the final mix. And then he ended up way over tinkering with the EQ on the vocals, so much so to the point of where he didn't really fix the problem, he actually just more or less exacerbated it. Well, Joni Mitchell was not happy with the final results and the overall sound on this album, and she has voiced her displeasure with it many times over the years, saying things like it sounded like it was recorded from underneath a glass bowl. And she has even gone on record to say that she thinks Crosby was incompetent and that he just simply didn't know what he was doing. Now, Joni Mitchell has never been one to mince her words, and she can actually be quite caustic in her opinions of others and in the way that she sees the rest of the world. Now, like myself, you may actually own this album, and you may be saying to yourself, now hold on a minute, I don't hear any of that. And I think that the album sounds fantastic, and the songs are quite beautiful. And you know what? I would agree with you. Unless you actually have the very first and the initial printings of this album on vinyl, well, then you are listening to one of the many different remixes of this album that have transpired over the years. In order to remedy this problem, the mic'd piano strings were just simply taken out of the mix, and then the vocal EQ was set to something that was much less drastic. And the album has also been remastered and re-released on both vinyl and CD. And regardless of any of this, Joni Mitchell's debut album actually sold modestly well, despite any of its shortcomings in its sound quality back in those early days. It has also sold better than any of the other purely acoustic folk albums that were released during that same time period. Remember, it was no longer really that hip in 1967 and 1968 to just be straight up folk without any of the other instruments such as drums, bass, electric guitar, etc. The reason that it sold as well as it did was because it simply had great songwriting on it. And even if it wasn't Joni's best work that was yet to come, it was actually a really good start. And after it was released, well, she was on her way. Now, as for her relationship with David Crosby, both professionally and personally, it was all but over by that point. They drifted apart, and they went their separate ways. other than remaining, well, basically kind of somewhat friends up and down over the years, and even working together on a few projects. They wrote some songs together later on. Now, David Crosby has said several times that he truly believes that Joni Mitchell would have eventually made it with or without him, and that she has always had the talents that were needed to make her a successful musician. He has stated that he believes she's the greatest songwriter who's ever lived. He has an extremely high opinion of her. He doesn't think anybody else comes close. Now, assuming that Joni Mitchell would have eventually gone on to the same success that she did, how and when that would have eventually happened, well, your guess is as good as mine on that one. It would have been a completely different story in a different place. But most likely, the final outcome would have probably been very similar to what actually happened in reality. So this is where David Crosby more or less exits the story, and Graham Nash enters it. Joni Mitchell bought this house in 1968, and after 53 years, she still owns it. She doesn't live here in the house anymore, but it's still hers. She paid $36,000 for it, and then she actually managed to pay the whole thing off within just a few years from the royalties that she had earned from her first 2 albums. Because in those days, musicians actually made money from their releases. Because back then, unlike today, people actually bought the music that they enjoyed listening to. Now, if you had the idea that maybe you wanted to buy this house now, it would cost you more in the range of about $1.8 million. But even if you had that kind of money, you would still be out of luck, because she wouldn't sell it to you, or anybody else for that matter. This house is very special to her. She's attached to it, and she has even stated many times that she believes that it's protected by some kind of a higher power. So in her lifetime, she has no plans to part with it. The house itself is actually quite modest. It's about 1,830 square feet of rustic charm, and it was built in 1910, which means that it was built roughly at about the same time that the tavern was built, just right over there on the corner of Lookout Mountain Avenue and Laurel Canyon Boulevard, which of course became the Tom Mix Cabin. And then, eventually, the well-known house of Frank Zappa, also which, unfortunately, is no longer with us because it burned down on Halloween night, 1981. But we're headed over in that direction right now to see what's left of that historic, famous property. So just a little side note before we head over to the Frank Zappa house. I just wanted to also let you know that every single song on the album Blue was written in the house, right in the living room that we're standing in front of. And I gotta tell you, if you don't have this album yet, you need to get it. This is a masterpiece. And not only is this one considered her finest work, this is actually considered the finest work pretty much just about anywhere in terms of recorded music. The lyrics on this album are just gut-wrenchingly honest. So honest, in fact, that after she had recorded it and had gone back and listened to what she had created and had a little bit of time to gain some perspective on it, she stated that she would never record another album like this one again. So it doesn't make any difference what kind of genre of music you listen to, what your favorite music is. You need to get this, because owning this album Blue by Joni Mitchell is really just more part of being human. Okay, just so you know where I'm at, I'm still standing in Joni's driveway. See the house that looks like a castle? Take a look at this photo. There's Joni in a treehouse in the backyard with Judy Collins, and there's the house. Now, there's only one single residence between Joni's place and the Frank Zappa property, so we're just gonna walk right down there. There's Laurel Canyon Boulevard up in the front. Did you see that? Did you see what just ran across the road? Take a closer look. Yep, that's a coyote running across Lookout Mountain Avenue. And he found himself a little hole in the fence. Awesome. Okay, here we come up to the Frank Zappa property. Let's take a closer look over the fence. What do we see? That's the guest house and the duck pond. Now, let's make this very clear. That's not the Tom Mix cabin. That is the guest house. We're going to take a closer look at it from a different angle as soon as we get up here. This property, by the way, is huge, and so we're just going to concentrate on what's down here on this end of it first, before I even get to the point of where I turn the corner up there on Laurel Canyon Boulevard. Now, here's the backside of the guest house. This is also called the Bird House, which I'll explain in just a minute. Now take a look in the middle of the screen, right there between the two trees. That's Joni Mitchell's house, and that's her kitchen window. Why is that significant? Well, I'm about to tell you. There's a funny story associated with that, and here it is. Now, as you know, Joni Mitchell moved into her house probably around April of 1968. So that means that Zappa got here to this property just a couple of months before she did. But they lived here at the same time in their respective houses. Now, one of the first things that Joni Mitchell did when she moved into her new house was she invited her mother from Canada to come and stay with her. Now, what happened was her mother was in the kitchen, and from that kitchen window, you can clearly see right down into the area where that duck pond is in front of the guest house. And in that duck pond was a group of scantily clad women frolicking about in the water. And when I say scantily clad, I mean more like topless or just completely nude. Well, when Joni's mom saw what was going on at the neighbor's house, she was appalled. And she made it very clear to Joni that she did not appreciate the new neighborhood that she had just moved into. Now, from what I understand, Joni was brought up in a very traditional, old-fashioned, religious kind of a household, and her mother, Myrtle, who was a school teacher, was an extremely conservative woman, and she obviously did not appreciate seeing the nudity, and she was so upset about it that she actually decided that she wanted to leave and to return to Saskatoon, which is up in Canada. You know, back like where normal people live who don't frolic about in the nude, probably because it's too cold. There are just a few misconceptions to clear up about the property where Frank Zappa lived in the old Tom Mix cabin. First of all, Zappa did live here in Laurel Canyon starting in 1966, but it was in a house somewhere that no one really seems to know anything about. And he did apparently also meet his wife Gail at that house. But Zappa didn't move into this house, which is behind me, located on the corner of Lookout Mountain Avenue and Laurel Canyon Boulevard, until about February or March of 1968. And that was after he had returned from a very long stint from working with his band in Greenwich Village in New York City. Now, he only lived here, actually, for less than about 6 months. And then he left and he bought a house over on the eastern side of Laurel Canyon, over on Woodrow Wilson Drive, which is where he ended up living until the very end of his days. So, why did he leave here so quickly? Well, that's a great question, and one that I'm going to try to do my best to answer. All right, now, before I go over around the corner up there on Laurel Canyon Boulevard and go around to what's the front side of the property and we start looking at what remains of the old Tom Mix cabin, there's one last little bit of information that I want to give you about this guest house back here. Now, I know I've already talked a lot about it, but there's some more important things to know. I have referred to it as not only the guest house, I've also called it the tree house and the bird house, as in Robert Byrd. Now, Robert Byrd was a very well-known architect who worked for a long time, like from the 1920s all the way up to the 1970s. And he designed a lot of homes around here in the Hollywood Hills, including this one. There's also another one that he designed almost at the same time that he was working on this one. Now, that one is about roughly 3.5 miles away from here to the west as the crow flies, and it's located at 10050 Cielo Drive. Now, some of you may already recognize that address. If you don't, here's a picture of that home. It's beautiful. Unfortunately, it had a very unhappy ending, and it's no longer there. 10050 Cielo Drive over in Benedict Canyon is where Hollywood director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate, were renting a home in 1969. And yes, that is the same house where Sharon Tate, her unborn child, and 4 other people were brutally murdered by members of the Manson family on the night of August 9th, 1969. Now, I am not going to go into any other details about that incident in this episode. It's going to come up again, unfortunately. There's no way around it. Those events were so interwoven with everything else that was happening here in Laurel Canyon at that time that it just has to come up. And it's almost impossible to ignore the topic just because it's unpleasant or disturbing. And all of this will start to become more clear when I begin talking about some of the other people who were involved, including some of the victims and the perpetrators. You might also be saying to yourself right now that all of this just seems like a minor connection and just maybe like some random and trivial little bits of information, not really that important or related to Frank Zappa himself. Well, that's not completely true. There is another connection with the Manson family that did directly involve Frank and his wife, Gail. And like I said, all of this is going to come up again later. Trust me. Now, in the meantime, let's get back to Frank Zappa and where he lived during the summer of 1968. Frank Zappa only lived to be 52 years old, but in his lifetime, his musically eccentric genius is basically second to no one, and his prolific output is just simply astounding. While he was still alive, he managed to write, record, and produce a total of 62 albums of original material in a 30-year period. And since his death in 1993, there was so much unreleased material that his wife Gail and his 4 children have been able to see that an additional 57 albums have now been released up to now. So that's a total of 119 albums worth of recorded material. 98% of all of those songs were recorded and mixed right here in Laurel Canyon at his various home studios. So this is what I have found while researching Frank Zappa. I find that I cannot simply sum him up, or his career, or his incredibly complex personality and belief system in just a few minutes. It's going to take just a bit more time. So, I've decided to give Frank Zappa his own chapter in this video series. And I'm going to continue the Frank Zappa story in the next episode. So this will give me some more time, and I won't have to feel so rushed to get it all in here in this one. Now, this was not my original plan, but it is now. So please, come back for the Frank Zappa conclusion. Okay, so we've been out here for a long time. Seen a lot of places, a lot of houses, had a lot of stories. But at the end of it, what I figured out was that there was just too much. I just couldn't fit everything in. Okay, so I came up with something that I like to call the great big list of everyone we missed. And I'm gonna go through a group here of about 9 or 10 different people and groups and just say a couple of little things about them, because I felt really bad in some cases. I knew that they were out here. In some cases, we even literally walked right past their house, and I just didn't have time to get all of this on film. So, here's the first one. Jackson Browne. Okay, I did briefly mention one of the episodes we went past his house, and that house now is the Embassy of Chile, I think. Anyway, he was a little bit elusive in this area because he didn't ever really seem to stay any place for a very long time. He was kind of like, I guess, what I would call a couch jumper. Now, I don't mean like a Tom Cruise couch jumper. What I'm saying is he just would crash on people's couches for a couple of weeks at a time, and then he'd be gone. So there's just too many places. I couldn't find them all. Now, I do have a little short story about him, that when he was 18 years old, he came out here, and he was starstruck because, you know, he wasn't famous yet, and he was trying to get himself established. He ended up at some party or whatever, walked in, and saw David Crosby sitting on a couch. And by the way, there's about 500 different stories of people walking into a party and seeing David Crosby on a couch. Anyway, Crosby was doing what he generally is doing, and that's sitting next to a guitar, playing a guitar, or rolling joints, or all at the same time, and which is what he was doing. So the story went something like, Crosby, hi, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. Well, what's your name? Well, my name is Jackson Browne. Oh, well, hey, Jackson, are you a musician? Yeah, I am. Well, here's a guitar. Play me a song. Go ahead, Jackson. Play me your best song. So he did. And apparently Crosby was impressed, and it just kind of went from there. Jackson Browne made the connections and, well, became who he became. So there you go. All right, the next one, Linda Ronstadt. Okay, here's another one. She kind of flirted in and out of this area every now and then, and it just basically depended on who she was with, what she was doing at the time. I think that she lived in some little community of bungalows that was in an area up by where the Hollywood Bowl is right now. She lived there with Don Henley and Glenn Frey for a while, and that was back in the Stone Ponies days, but the house is gone now because now it's part of the parking lot. About the only story that I really have about her is that at one point in the early 1980s, she was living with the former governor of California, who was Jerry Brown. He was the governor of California at that time. And they lived on Wonderland Avenue, just 2 doors down from the Wonderland murder house when that happened in 1981. Okay, now I'm not sure if they were home at the time, but yeah, apparently they were just a couple doors down from the infamous Wonderland murder house. So there you go, Linda Ronstadt. Okay, who else we got? Bonnie Raitt, and she played with a band called Little Feat. She got here kind of during what we call the second wave, you know, the early to mid 70s, kind of about the same time that the Eagles were taking off. I have no idea where she lived. That's all I know about her. All right, so who else do we have on our list here? Okay, we have Poco. And Poco, also known as the farm team for the Eagles. About all I actually really know about them is that Richie Furay used to live in a house about maybe a quarter mile up the road here on Laurel Canyon Boulevard at the corner of Laurelmont. That's about all I know. The Turtles. Again, they all lived happy together somewhere in Laurel Canyon. I just have no idea where.